actually the term we now use for sub-editors. Nō reira, tēnā koutou ngā karu hō miro miro. I nei ka huri tātou, ki taua wahine toa anō, Melanie Mark-Shadbolt. If you don't know who she is, where have you been the last couple of days? She is a lot of things, one of them being the Ministry for the Environment's Kaihautu Chief Māori Advisor, and of course Chief Executive of Te Tira Whakamātaki. So please welcome her back to the stage for the next panel. Tēnā koe.
Kia ora koutou. I'm just waiting for my boy band to get seated. They're going to break out into synchronised dance soon. I've been practising. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to, or carrying on of this Whakahau Restore session on Aotearoa's unique approach to ecosystem restoration. Our topic in particular is New Zealand's biodiversity trajectory, shifting the dial from extraction to restoration. Very lucky to be joined by a panel of very learned men, and we will introduce them and ask them a question and then open the floor to other questions. So they will get a wee chance to have a kōrero first. So the planet we are occupying is dying, and as we heard, we are facing new, emerging and much larger threats than ever before. The unsustainable patterns of economic activity we have been following have led to a build-up of systemic risk across sectors and major risks to human life and prosperity. Things like air pollution, biological hazards and overdependence on single crops are putting much pressure on our environment, and in particular our biodiversity. We are now threatened with undermining the entire natural infrastructure in which our modern world, including our economic models, depend on. So how do we shift the dial from a model of extraction to one of restoration? To discuss this with me today is my boy band. And starting first with Peter Brunt. Peter is the Director of Policy for Te Papa Atawhai, the Department of Conservation. In that role, he was responsible for facilitating the development of the new biodiversity strategy for Aotearoa, New Zealand. The last one was developed back in 2000, so a wee while ago. Peter has a long background in environmental and energy policy in New Zealand and in Europe. He arrived at DOC in 2017, and prior to that, he had led freshwater, RMA, climate change for the Ministry for the Environment. Before even arriving in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2019, Peter worked for the European Parliament in the UK Energy and Environmental Ministries on lots of various issues, from transportation to nuclear power, energy, those kinds of things. So I'm mindful that DOC, like we just said, is currently working on the new biodiversity strategy. Given work on biodiversity is a combination of both the bottom-up and a top-down approach, how do we ensure bottom-up and top-down work better together so that we reach all parts of our community?
Okay, kia ora, everybody. So that is one of the key questions that the new biodiversity strategy, which, little plug, will be coming out for consultation July, August, will I think pose. So we're quite conscious that biodiversity is quite a complex system. It's got loads and loads of actors in it. And I think, as came up in the panel just a moment ago, there's a national framework part of it. So we kind of tend to think of it in terms of national role being frameworks and facilitation. But that national framework can only take you so far. So, you can't, intrinsically, biodiversity is a local set of issues and have to be responded to, particularly when you get into restoration, in kind of local contextual kind of ways. So I think kind of one of our kind of key questions of biodiversity strategy is, when you're thinking about that sort of facilitation and that sort of frameworks context, how deep and how far should government go? So government is developing an NPS, a national policy statement on biodiversity. So what, how prescriptive should that be versus how facilitative should that be of kind of local community groups? How does government play in the role of the treaty partner in helping to manage biodiversity on the ground? All of those sorts of things. So it's not something I've got a pithy answer to, but it's a kind of like a kind of balancing act. And how, in that facilitation and that kind of framework role, can we as central government kind of, particularly addressing things like economic frameworks, start to kind of build through this new strategy kind of, a bit of a progress going forward?
Definitely. Well, we'll probably come back to some of that, I think. But I'm going to introduce Dave on the end of the lineup at the moment. Dave helps iwi and hapu develop innovative and future-focused policy and legislation so that they can better influence decision-making to support mana whenua and mana moana. Environmental restoration as a mean to achieve sustainable management of our natural resources and taonga is a key priority for him. You were the environmental manager, is that correct, for Ngāti Rangi before joining Perception Planning last year. And you have over 12 years experience, I'm sure it's over that, customary fisheries management, environmental focused relationship management, local, regional, national policy plans, and regulatory engagement. You're passionate about biosecurity and have been very active in the Kodi dieback space, and cultural landscape design, capability and capacity building. So given that Peter has just been talking about engaging communities, the bottom-up approach, what role does Te Ao Māori have in shifting the dial and connecting people more firmly to nature?
Kia ora Mel. Mauri ora tātou. Just quickly want to mihi to our kaumātua for our karakia this morning and for carrying and asking for blessings from our atua and carrying the kaupapa for all of us here today and our behaviour. So kia ora koutou, e rangatira mā. Just in regards to what role does Te Ao Māori have, it's a holistic approach. So it's difficult to just hone in on one single species or issue to one single species. So it's really about having a good overview on a balanced approach. So holistic and balanced. It's a primary role in regards to Māori and Te Ao Māori in this kaupapa, in all kaupapa actually. And so it's just around expressing the urgency of acknowledging and resourcing mana whenua from flax roots up in this type of kaupapa.
Kia ora. Next to Dave is David, not to be confused with Dave. David is a professor at the University of Canterbury and teaches and researches ecology and conservation biology. His research interests centre on ways to obtain win-win outcomes for native biodiversity, conservation and farming in sheep and beef farming systems, which account for 40% of New Zealand's land area. As part of this, he has a strong interest in restoration ecology and how we use this as a tool to enhance and expand native biodiversity at landscape scales in the systems. So, David, some would suggest that our economic models have proved to be unsustainable and have led to the plundering of the planet. Is it possible to continue on this trajectory, or should we be considering new economic paradigms?
Kia ora, Mel. Thank you for that question and for the introduction. I think it's a really important question, and I noticed in the discussion just at the end of the last lot of speakers that was one of the last questions that came up, and I think, Brad, you answered it. I think when I look at biodiversity and farmland, I mean, I see farmland being fundamentally critical for New Zealand. 50% plus of New Zealand's pastoral farming. The current intensive models aren't working. We all know the stats around that. I think we've got to look at trying to change the models of farming. We've got to change them both because of the impacts on the environment, but also to make the ability for us to be able to sell our products, get an income into New Zealand that can then support the biodiversity work that we need to have done here. And I think we need to shift away from our commodity-driven focus, milk solids, legs of lamb, logs, going across our wharfs, to one that is really adding value to what we're doing in New Zealand. If we can add value, get a higher return for our products overseas, we need to have fewer animals in New Zealand, we'll get more income, there's more money for biodiversity. So absolutely, I think win-win outcomes are going to be the result of that.
Yeah, so those win-win solutions are a reality, not a pipe dream?
I think they are, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Sean Neely, thank you. Sean Neely grew up on a dairy farm in northern region of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and has spent most of his working life involved with farming in the South Island. Sean is of Ngaitahu descent. You took on your first farm manager's role in 2003 and went on to become a 50-50 share milker before moving into roles in corporate agribusiness. Prior to his current role as the Aquila Sustainable Farming General Manager, is that right? You were the CEO of Fortuna Group, which was a large Southland-based corporate dairy farming business focused on high environmental and financial stewardship of land assets. Aquila are organic farms. They represent the largest conversion of dairy farming to organic certification in New Zealand, full certification for 5,500 cows. Wow. Sean has been working with the AFS Organic Group since January 2017 and has built a solid reputation for achieving and mainstreaming organic certification at scale while developing good commercial outcomes. So my question for you is, a prominent, will not be named, environmental NGO has publicly stated that dairying and fishing industries were to blame for all of our environmental woes. As a dairy farmer, are those statements true, fair and/or helpful?
So helpful is quite easy to answer. So when you've got lobby groups shooting across the bow of other lobby groups, it doesn't really encourage a good discussion at all. So the answer is that, the helpful question. And there's a piece that's been fairly consistent through the discussions over the last day and a half around trying to see things from a different point of view and involving Indigenous points of view with Western points of view, but also the idea probably spreads across to scientific understanding of what's going on, commercial reality on businesses that are trying to operate in different spaces, lobby groups who are really focused on different environmental aspects, and landholders, if you like, that are operating in ways that might not be up to spec or up to a standard that those lobby groups would like to see. So it's not helpful at all. The conversation really needs to move from pointing out all the issues all the time to trying to offer some solutions, trying to encourage good behaviours and making champion of people who are already acting well in the space. There are a lot of farmers already who are doing some very good stuff. It's always been that way. A lot of farm owners are very proud, very environmentally focused, but we don't hear a lot about them. We just hear about all of the negative consequences all the time.
Yeah. So then a question for all four of you is, should we focus, there's so much focus on the negative, what successes or positive stories are there in terms of restoration? Yeah, of course.
I think it's an interesting, working with the farming community, and we do much of our research on farmland with farmers, and my feeling is that most farmers are really happy to get on, do what they do the restoration work they do, but they don't necessarily want to stand up and wave a flag and say, hey, I've done all this great work. They just get on and do it. And I think, it's obviously it's often not very visible, but it's going on out there, and there's a lot of good stuff happening out there.
Sean, Peter?
So, if I were going to cite something, then aside from the kind of individual species programs and trajectories and various other things, it's the sheer number of particularly landscape scale kind of projects and programs that are now blossoming out there. When I think about Taranaki Maunga, I think about Pukaha to Palliser, when I think about the top of the south, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a real groundswell, some of it driven by Predator Free 2050, some of it driven by the connection between that and a whole series of other restoration drivers, which is starting to bring together biodiversity, fresh water, climate change, land, sea, and kind of air in a way that perhaps we haven't seen before. That to me is a good projection of the future of this stuff.
There's a good tie-in around good activities and value-add discussions, as David brought up. So there are opportunities for marketing a product better than what New Zealand typically does. Unfortunately, we've been focused on just trying to create volume of product and move it as quick as we can. And all the infrastructure around moving that product to markets is really commodity-driven, and it's impacted by seasonality as well. So our marketing teams have to deal with volume all at once, try and get it out, get it sold. And we're not actually skilled at value add.
Yeah.
But there are small players who do it well and have done for a long time. Organics has been an opportunity for our business, at least, to kind of step into that market. Our product now is considered niche. It earns a premium. It's no longer value added, and it's a very viable model for operating a farm, lower intensity, and doing some good work there.
Yeah. I want to pick up on one of the questions on here, the bottom one. So it's aimed at you, Peter, but I'm sure there's other voices for this one. What opportunities are there for economic tools and incentives to help shift the dial?
Thank you, Anonymous. Lots, I think, potentially. So again, plug, one of the key questions, I think, for our biodiversity strategy will be around the use of those economic tools. So, and I think those economic tools both sit within, kind of what scope there is within the tax system, for example, targeted rates. I think in economic incentives, to the degree to which you can build on some of the kind of, through the various ways in which we support the industry, some of the sort of niche marketing that's been described kind of next to me. And I think there's also some of the economic instruments that are out there at the moment in terms of kind of natural resources are the ways in which we can explore the utilisation of synergies between carbon farming, for example, and the biodiversity outcomes we can kind of drive. So I think there's lots of opportunity for us to kind of explore those economic instruments over the next 6 to 18 months.
Yeah. David, do you want to
I
add?
think I'll add a comment on that. I mean, I agree. I think there's a lot of room for economic instruments and whether it is, and I see there's a question there about carbon, so I'll cover that at the same time. I mean, I think, carbon is one of those economic incentives that's out there, and there are many others. But some of the economic incentives, I think, need to be direct, and so carbon's an obvious direct incentive, but others can be indirect. So just simply having value-added products that we're getting a better price for internationally is also a really good incentive to change the way you farm, and using biodiversity as part of the marketing of the farm product. And you've got to look at what, say, Merino Company did with fine walls, and there are other models like that in New Zealand where that biodiversity becomes part of the story and it can get a much higher value for the farmer, so it creates a greater incentive for farmers. I think we need both those direct incentives as well as those more indirect incentives. But I think just to add another comment on carbon, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges with carbon is that it's great that the carbon price is going up again, and hopefully it'll keep going up. But there is that 1990 cutoff, and there's an awful lot of regenerating vegetation across sheep and beef farms and all farms in New Zealand that doesn't meet the definitions of the 1990 cutoff. Yet that's putting carbon away all the time, and we need to try and somehow build that into the incentive systems as well, so farmers can get a credit out of that carbon that's being sequestered, because it's really important. There's lots of it happening out there.
Yeah, thank you. The question I had was around the regulator's role in these new economic paradigms, and I think it kind of relates to, we can tie in some of this question that's targeted at you again, Peter, how biodiversity is taken into account in the 2019 wellbeing budget. So what is the role of government regulators in not only the wellbeing budget and biodiversity, but in potential economic models?
So I'll deal with the wellbeing budget because that's kind of nice and simple. So obviously I can't yet tell you how biodiversity is taken into account in the wellbeing budget, because that obviously gets revealed when, when the Minister of Finance stands up and kind of talks his talk. So what I'll talk about wellbeing more generally, and I think wellbeing is a kind of great hook and a great opportunity for biodiversity more generally, and for connections to be built more generally. So you kind of just have to look at the kind of the tourism strategy that's just been launched by a Minister of Conservation and Minister of Tourism together, to see kind of the way in which this government is sort of stitching together economic, social, cultural, and environmental in kind of new and different ways. So I think when you think about biodiversity and the kind of centre to which it might have for marking a product or a destination, or for recreation and health, there's a beautiful opportunity with wellbeing to start making connections and kind of across that economic space more broadly in a way that we haven't before. Yeah. Now, in terms of kind of economic regulation, that's not kind of my personal area of expertise, so that's a difficult one for me to answer. But I think if you think about that wellbeing budget and you think about the different ways of measuring economic success, that's a good start for then tracking on to the sorts of things you might want to draw through financial markets, through the way in which you market New Zealand products and develop economic strategy. Yeah. I think Treasury here today would be a kind of good.
That would be nice. Sean, do you want to comment on what industry would like to see in wellbeing budgets and see potential regulators? It's not only just DOC, it's the MFEs and MPIs and Treasury thinking about in terms of making it easier for industry to restore.
So the wellbeing discussion is quite interesting for us, because the rural sector really does struggle with all sorts of issues around mental health. It's a stressful environment. So there's probably a lack of understanding and communication at the farm level, at the ground level for the whole sector. And I would like to see government agencies especially, but people in general, putting more effort into doing that and having better communication and taking people on the journey, because all the negativities, it weighs pretty heavily on quite a few people.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a good point.
There.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I think one of the really big challenges I think for getting good biodiversity outcome across farming parts of New Zealand is that we've got to shift from the current sort of blame sort of thing that's going on, and what you quoted before, Mel, about farmers being to blame for everything. And we've got to start developing trust. We've got to start developing respect. We've got to start, actually working together and accepting that these are New Zealand challenges, and different people and different groups bring different skills in. And I think at the moment there's far too much, suspicion and lack of trust, and we've got to really break that down. And we've got to actually trust that farmers, if incentivised properly, will be able to manage biodiversity. And farmers at the same time have to trust that there are lots of stakeholders who are interested in how they manage their land and can help them manage their land. And we've got to break down those sorts of barriers and build that trust and respect. And I think that's really important. And a lot of that's not about regulation. It's about other ways of doing it, collaborative ways of doing it.
So it's a good question to follow on that we had discussed earlier is how do we empower community action without trying to control, coordinate or stifle the community? For any of you, how do we empower communities without stifling them? Including our farming community.
I'll kick off then. I mean, my view is we've got to give a lot more support from the bottom up. Yeah. There's lots of groups out there, whether it's individual landowners, land care groups, rural communities, iwi, based on marae, whether it's urban populations with an interest. We've got to give them support, not just technical support, but financial support. And we've got to put in place decent incentives that allow them to be able to do that, work. And I think that's really important. I mean, it's great to talk to people and tell them how to do it. We've actually got to give them, the landowners and the others, actually the skills so they've got ownership of those things. And I think one of the biggest threats for biodiversity is not giving landowners ownership of that biodiversity and ownership of the management.
Yeah.
And some support with technical expertise. So there's actually there's groups all across the country around different water catchments that need special focus, and landowners themselves are kind of trying to lead the charge. And some of them come from a different ideology, and they just need some support to help understand what they're dealing with a lot better.
I was going to ask, hold on one minute. Dave, I was going to ask whether that resonates with you in terms of what we see on the ground for mana whenua, and what does ownership mean in terms of owning our biodiversity and access to technical expertise?
Yeah, kia ora. And just to carry on from David's kōrero around being able to help communities in mana whenua, whānau, hapu, marae, build the skills and have that being resource, and just goes back to my point of shifting the paradigm from top to bottom to flex roots up. I think it resonates through the kōrero that we've just been having, and just empowering and enabling that to happen from the flex roots up. So just reiterating my previous sort of kōrero.
David.
Yeah,
That's all right.
I think, again, with the farming community, it's interesting. You look at who advises farmers. Farmers are busy business people, they're not ecologists, so they get advice from different places. They're suspicious of councils, they're suspicious of government agencies. Most of their advice comes from, banking reps, from fertiliser reps, from farm consultants, from stock and station agents. None of those people have got ecology degrees. None of those people know much about ecology. There's some real gaps in getting information out there to the people that then advise the farmers. And I think that to me is another really big challenge. We've got to break down and get that information out there in a way that those advisors can then advise farmers, and the farmers themselves can get the information too about what to do.
Actually, that's an important consideration to have if you want to think about where to target advice and new knowledge. And a lot of the expertise that farmers rely on for things like nutrients comes from the people that sell them nutrients. So that would be a good starting point.
I think another key area for the farming industry as well is there's some leading sort of farmers across the country that are shifting into new spaces and diversifying into other areas, which is promising.
Yeah. I was going to pick one of the questions. I might need to get the technicians to pull it up. I think it's down the bottom. What opportunities do you see for extraction and restoration to occur together? It's the bottom, if you could grab that one. There we go. Would, for example, selective harvest native timber plantations make a difference for biodiversity? Go, David.
I think in the right place the answer is yes. And the classic example in New Zealand is tōtara. I mean, tōtara grows like a weed in the north. less so down in my part of the country. And I think tōtara is regenerating on farmland through Northland, through parts of East Cape and some of those higher rainfall, warmer areas in New Zealand. Tōtara grows really, really well. And you know, it can be managed for timber under a sustainable management plan or sustainable management permit through MPI. Has to be fenced off. It's a specific requirement. Livestock have to be excluded, so the biodiversity is going to benefit. I think there's real opportunities for win-win outcomes, particularly of a tree like tōtara, which is, at the end of the day, probably the most important New Zealand native tree in terms of its use and its cultural importance and everything else.
And just to add a layer of caution over that question and David's approach there, I just like to go back to Te Ao Māori holistic approach, and if we start extracting single species out of the ngahere or whatever a resource might be, whether it's gravel or whatever, we need to just maintain, you know, is that sustainable, is it balanced, and does it maintain the health of our ngahere, which is a big issue at the moment.
Ka pai, Dave.
And I'd also add reducing species, you know, extracting species is the opposite of increasing biodiversity, in my view.
Yeah.
So it's more monoculture focus.
Cool. I want to grab this one that says for all the panel. Jack made the comment yesterday that farmers are doing better in terrestrial biodiversity protection. Then, well, you can see then moves. Putative impacts around freshwater. Do you agree with this? Should we start? Move along. Anyone want to go?
I actually don't know the answer to that question, and I'm quite interested in the gentleman to my left's view. So certainly I would say the narrative around freshwater is certainly pointier than the narrative around terrestrial biodiversity. So I think of lots of examples, but that may just be the perspective I come from. I think of lots of examples of really strong terrestrial-based partnerships which flow my way, whereas the freshwater debate does seem to be particularly pointy, but very interested in your view. Bing.
Mr. Farmer.
Amble. So the stuff around biodiversity with the QE2 Trust, and so there's a whole lot of things that farmers are engaged in, but it's not all farmers. And there are enough of us who are still cost-focused producers who probably need a wake-up call and need to do more. Are we doing better than we are around freshwater? In our catchment at least, I think no. I think the discussion around freshwater is really, really relevant. There's a looming risk to businesses that aren't trying to improve their operation around having restrictions put in place that really undermine how they operate. So, and I think that's true across most of the country, that farmers are seriously considering what they're doing, what impact it's having around freshwater. What they don't have is the solutions, and so that's what they're looking for. And you know, solutions that allow them to stay in business, because at the moment the solutions that look like they could work for freshwater mean less productivity, and without a value-add opportunity, which is kind of the space I operate in, trying to encourage people to think about organics and other value-add opportunities. Without that being front of mind, they're at a loss as to how to maintain the viability of their business as the change happens.
Yeah. Dave, you want to add to that?
Just a real example, I guess, and with one of the largest sort of Māori farming organisations in Central Plateau, the iwi there have teamed up and hold them to account in regards to their farming practices, especially in freshwater. And so it's a really good example of how mana whenua hapu iwi are engaging with a corporate sort of farming, key stakeholder or key land manager of the area. And so there's been opportunities for the environmental team from the iwi to actually monitor key waterways. So yeah, you know, there are some that's happening step by step.
Yeah. And kia ora for that, and to acknowledge that we do have Miraka and Tuaraupaki in the whare today, so if anyone wants to talk about Māori dairy farming, then there's two people to go track down. Let's start at the top, Peter, and take a wee shift of focus to marine, because it is often the forgotten cousin. I know that it's outside our remit is a challenge, but we certainly have some issues in the marine space. How do we shift the dial for marine restoration?
So it's definitely within the circle for the biodiversity strategy. So obviously marine environment, nice and easy and non-complex, and no competing sort of interests there. So for me, so with that complexity in mind, for me the sort of starting point is, so So I personally, so this is not speaking on behalf of government or ministers, I'm really taken by the approach in the Hauraki Gulf around sea change, this concept of sort of spatial planning. So this kind of idea that similar to the sort of landscape scale approach we've been talking about for a kind of for an area of terrestrial land across freshwater and land, that you kind of take an approach focused on kind of an area of kind of the marine environment, and you attempt to work out your kind of uses and your kind of protections and kind of what's more or less important in a kind of joined up kind of way. So for me, that sort of a process like that, driven through some kind of mechanism, is the kind of key to kind of future engaging and delivering on kind of marine protection. There's lots and lots of steps and lots of thoughts to be kind of gone through there. How does our existing regulatory and legislative regime work in that space? How does fisheries and oil and gas and marine protection and marine mammal sanctuary legislation and all the other 10 trillion different ways of kind of managing the marine environment fit together in that context? So just some initial thoughts.
Good. And are we coordinating those conversations across the various ministries that are?
We are.
Oh, very good. Dave.
Kia ora. I guess it's my responsibility to talk to this as being a coastal hapu. And really, I guess it's Te Aotearoa, ki uta ki tai. And that's really around the whole environment from the mountains to the sea. And so I guess it's all the land management or land uses that impact on the awa or rivers and then spill out big, huge plumes into our moana. So we need to get a lot sorted on our mountains, on the whenua and the awa, and then that will automatically make a difference for our moana.
Yeah. Let's take the top one. How can biodiversity restoration be better linked to climate change adaptation and mitigation? Isn't there a big opportunity to work on these two mega issues together? David, do you want to have a go?
Yep, no, happy to answer that. I mean, I think everyone's familiar with 1 billion trees. It's been had a lot of discussion the last year or so, and I mean, clearly it's an important tool for working with climate change. So restoration, bringing more forest in, is going to sequester more carbon. But at the end of the day, trees are never going to be the answer. The answer is those cars we drive and all the other things we do, and I guess the number of cattle we have on our farms as well. And I think trees are part of the answer, and they're really important. It's a great chance to get an awful lot more native habitat out there, but it's not shouldn't be done in isolation from all the other stuff.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on that one? Because I think it leads nicely into the next one otherwise. Yeah, so the next one is specific targets, like you just said, about, the billion trees is a great idea. Predator-Free 2050 created this movement. It's created an incentive and momentum. Climate change is sexy. We can sell climate change, but how do we need something similar for ecological restoration? Do we need something similar to climate change for biodiversity? Go, Peter.
So we'd certainly like one. So we think there's a one down below. There's a little question down below around crazy ambitious with the biodiversity strategy. So we'd like the biodiversity strategy to be crazy ambitious. So one thing that we have observed is exactly this: that if you have a kind of clear, key and inspiring kind of longer term goal you want to end up with, then that tends to kind of focus minds. It's not tomorrow, but you can kind of build your steps towards it. It's fair to say in our initial conversations today, trying to get someone to come up with a crazy ambitious long term goal for restoration is a little bit like, I don't know, herding cats. So but we'd be very interested in suggestions for what a 2050 goal for restorations might look like.
So that's a challenge to everyone here, though. Challenge to everyone here to come up with a crazy ambitious goal for Peter.
I think I have a bigger challenge.
Yeah. Go.
Yeah. So the goal having a goal defined would be great, but to get the action for the landowners, it's really what are they going to monitor? How are they going to know how they're tracking? At this stage, farmers in general are typically quite data rich, but it's all around productivity and cost structures. But if you give them a target, they can usually do pretty well at trying to hit it. So if you had some targets on biodiversity on something that was able to be monitored in a ecosystem and encourage farmers to try and hit those targets, I think we'd see some really good action. But we don't know farmers don't know what those targets would be.
So challenge back to you, Peter, some targets.
I think the answer to the question about targets, I mean, it's happening all around New Zealand already. I mean, think about all the landscape level conservation projects that are out there. Banks Peninsula Conservation Trust, Cape to City, Reconnecting Northland, all of these projects around the country have got their own targets that are being developed for their own regions. And I think we're actually, again, it's that bottom-up stuff. It's already happening, and I think there's some incredibly exciting things that are occurring already.
Dave, anything to add? Cool. I think there's a similar, there's a question while we're carrying on with this about benchmarking has been used in the space to drive increased restoration. Would this be beneficial, Sean?
Benchmarking of what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or ask Mr. Anonymous.
It would be, benchmarking is hugely beneficial. If you can have some good operators and you can see how they operate compared to you, that's really helps people drive what they're doing. So, but first of all, you need to know what you're trying to benchmark. It needs to be valuable. It needs to be the right benchmark.
Are there examples of benchmarking overseas or in other areas that we could adapt?
Probably not easily. No. So,
Okay.
but there are a lot of activities. Farmers are constrained in different countries for all sorts of different ecological reasons, and some of them have much more positive impacts than others. In some countries, farmers are required to leave entire nature strips next to waterways, so that you've actually got channels where nature can travel without having to cross farmland, and so there's all sorts of things other countries are trying to do.
Yeah, David.
I think I'll make a couple of comments on there. I think what I mentioned before about extension being really important. I mean, farmers can't benchmark, or community groups can't benchmark without having the right information, so getting really good extension out there is really important. I think the other thing that goes with that, though, as well, and I think this comes back to what I was saying earlier on about needing to add value to our farm and forest products in New Zealand to get a higher price. We've got to be able to show that we're actually doing what we say we're doing, and I think really good independent auditing certification is essential to actually show that we are getting the benefits for biodiversity of the work we're doing across all this part of New Zealand.
Cool. Could we incentivise retirement of highly erodible land with more tools than the Billion Trees program?
So I think that would be a great opportunity. There's still a significant amount of land that's attempting to be farmed that's not actually that productive, and if you were to break that farming asset base up and put that land aside, the farm would actually be more financially viable, not having to actively manage that block of land. So, thank you. Huge opportunity there, I think. Yeah.
So if government can double or triple 1 billion trees and put it all in natives, it's going to be win-win for everybody.
So it leads really nicely into the next question, Peter. How do people have a say on shaping the biodiversity strategy? And are you looking for ideas like that?
Yes. And thank you, Andrea. So, yes, so essentially we will launch a discussion document, fingers crossed, depending on cabinet processes, in July or August, and there'll be a couple of months for consultation. So it'll be an online consultation you can respond to directly, no matter who you are, but we'll also be travelling around the country, essentially for a series of sort of public meetings and various other bits and pieces. So keep an eye on the kind of DOC website, and we will kind of be out there very, very soon with some quite big fundamental questions. So the nature of the strategy, I'll just ramble a little bit more, is we're looking at something which is probably going to be a sort of high-level framework and then a living document, an ongoing rolling series of actions. So here's what the distant future looks like. Here's what the next 5 years looks like. Update. One of our big learnings from the 2000 strategy is you can write a document, get everyone very enthusiastic, sits on a desk, gets a bit dusty after 5 years, everyone forgets about it, never returns to it. So how can we build something which actually captures people's imagination and keeps this conversation going on an ongoing basis?
Yeah.
Stop.
So feedback opportunities soon. I want to use that question to ask a few of my own, and that is around the role of our treaty partners. So how do we properly reflect the role of the treaty partner in not only restoration planning, which is probably a good question for you, Dave, but also how is the role of the treaty partner going to be reflected in the biodiversity strategy for you, Peter? I'll start with you, Dave.
I guess it's probably the easiest way to explain it is using the notion of a waka model. So that's a twin-hulled waka, where we have one treaty partner in one hull and the other treaty partner in the other hull. And the mahi that happens in each hull complements what happens in the middle. So the shared resources, the shared knowledge, the shared development and outcomes are all shared in the middle. And we need both both teams in each hull to actually be going in the same direction at the same time, at the same pace, with the same purpose. So that's probably the best way I could explain what that treaty partnership would look like, but also still maintaining, enabling and resourcing from the flax roots up.
So I think two key ways. So you'll get to see soon how we've tried to reflect it in the discussion document. But so two key aspects, and that's a beautiful analogy and a brilliant analogy. So one is Te Ao Māori and sort of building that into the way in which we articulate the strategy and kind of choose the actions we want to take. So we're particularly struck, for example, in the way in which Te Ao Māori kind of really incorporates the nature and people in a kind of nice kind of single kind of concept, which kind of takes us away from the previous biodiversity versus people, kind of social, cultural versus environmental. So and our understanding of the environment and the state of biodiversity. So hopefully you'll see in which way we try to take Te Ao Māori kind of through the discussion document, through the strategy. And the other has to be around decision making. So kind of one of our big questions is likely to be, so you recognise that kaitiaki role, and kind of both at a kind of national and a kind of regional specific level. How does that actually factor into the nature of the decision making and how government makes decisions? So lots of models around now in a conservation context, because obviously land is currently in conservation land has a lot of history, generally speaking, a lot of close relationships with the iwi on the ground. So lots of particular models are the kind of ways we can learn from those models and apply them to kind of decision making, both around conservation and biodiversity more generally.
So we talk about obviously the role of tangata tiriti and tangata whenua. What about the rights of nature in the biodiversity strategy? And maybe Dave, you might want to even elaborate on this. So how do we honour the rights of the whenua and the rights of the wai in our strategies and in our planning and our decision making?
I guess that's probably a responsibility for mana whenua to actually share that understanding more in these types of forums and at place, sharing what our connection means to our whanaunga and the ngahere, in the wai and in the moana. But I guess probably the best way to sort of explain that would be taking a shift from restoration for conservation to actually restoration for sustainable harvesting is probably the goal for myself and mana whenua.
Yeah. Anyone else want to comment? No? I'm mindful that we are running down on time and that not everyone has access to the app, as Stacey said. Is there any questions from the floor, from anyone? Feel free to yell out or to let us know if you have a burning question and you don't have access to the app. I wanted to elaborate, and Dave, probably I'll start with you as well, on a comment that Aroha made yesterday around putting people back in the environment and the conservation philosophy, which is kind of a lock it up and leave it and extract people from that process, and how that doesn't seem to be working. Do you want to comment on the connection that Māori have, or mana whenua, tangata whenua have to the land, and what maybe your aspirations are, your hapu and your iwi, in terms of regaining access to your lands? Or?
Sure, huge. I'll try and touch on it briefly, but I guess in the context of kaitiaki on the ground, it's a hard battle. It's a very hard battle on the different impacts on the land and in the wai. And so a lot of it's voluntary, and we have a lot of community groups that carry out this mahi voluntary. I mean, an example would be a kaumātua is up at 5 o'clock in the morning reading reports. He's off to school to teach during the day. After school, he's off to hui, and then scoping more reports after that. So on a voluntary basis, and that's our elders, that's our kaumātua that are carrying out this mahi. And so, there's a lack of good resourcing to help the next generations come through. There's a lot of talent that we already have, as we can see throughout this room and at place. And so I guess one of the key things that drivers, especially through the Coyote Dieback program, is to enable, that capacity building for mana whenua and community groups to be able to make a difference on the ground. The connection that we have to our whenua is a whakapapa connection. We whakapapa to the kauri, we whakapapa to the ika. And we have a responsibility And it's a big mamae at the moment, especially with the Kauri dieback is probably the best example at the moment. That's our rangatira, that's our tupuna that's not looking good for him. So there's a sense of urgency. There has been a sense of urgency for generations in regarding to bringing that balance back. So it's a big hard task, and it shouldn't be just left up to us. It's left up, we need to share that mahi across all of us that are obviously here for the purpose in this room. So ko tātou.
Oh, kia ora, Dave, and we certainly feel the mamae, that responsibility and that sadness that we have. But I also want to reflect that back to the farming community, because Sean, you touched earlier on the mental health issues for our farming community and the mamae that they may feel given, the finger pointing that goes on. So is there anything, you want to elaborate on in terms of how do we come together, be more respectful? I'm mindful of Andrea's talk this morning about inclusivity and diversity in terms of healing some of those, wounds between the public's perception of the environment and what they think the industry are doing.
I think there's opportunity just around starting to talk about some of the good actions. So we still need to highlight issues and talk about that stuff. It doesn't need to be such a strong finger-pointing process. Probably farming lobby groups don't always help when they're very defensive. So, we do have opportunities, business programs like Country Calendar where we talk about good things, but I think there just needs to be more of it. We need to bring those people along to discussions and try and increase the opportunity for that. Yeah. It is challenging though. A lot of these people work, long hours every day, and so they're remote, and it's a big challenge. Yeah,
and I'm going to hand over to David to answer probably one of those top questions. But I just wanted one more thing, Sean. I heard, and I don't even know if it's true, but I heard a wee while ago from a farm representative that even farmers' children are struggling in school, being bullied for polluting the waterways and getting the finger pointed. So those kinds of things happening in the farming community, are they actually, or are they just stories that we hear where farmers are, like our 1080 crew getting finger pointed?
I've got children at school, so at primary school, and it seems to me that they get bullied for all sorts of reasons. So the potential is high, especially if you've got a community that's mixed and there's urban and rural. That especially, if it's in the media and people are talking about it a lot, I can see that would be an issue. Yep.
Yeah. David, do you want to give a go at the top one there? How do we ensure carbon farming and 1 billion tree incentives don't result in our farming landscape being covered in pine trees?
Which is certainly not what I want to see. I think Cabinet did say in their directive about 1 billion trees, was it someone else he might know, I think it was 2/3 are supposed to be native. I hope that follows through and actually on the ground planting. But I mean, that to me is the answer. Te Rako just say we will only fund so much in plantation, the rest has got to be native, and the more native the better from my point of view.
Yeah. There is a challenge on top of that around carbon credits and how they're valued. And so the speed at which we can grow pines means that they're a more valuable resource for a financially focused business. I think that's a challenge that needs to be addressed.
Peter?
I just add is obviously the 1 billion trees incentives, and carbon farming doesn't sit within a vacuum. So there is a thing called the RMA, there is a thing called the National Environmental Standard on plantation forests that is being reviewed to kind of ensure that the biodiversity elements of it are kind of strong. So, so the intent, ministers certainly expresses right tree, right place, right time. So, so I think there are a few backstops which help to prevent things like this.
Cool. What is the role of farm environmental plans in shifting the dial to restoration? How would you like to see these used in the future?
I'll answer that one. I'm a great proponent of farm environment plans. I think they've got a really fundamentally important role. I mean, Sheep and Beef has said they want to see every sheep and beef farmer in New Zealand have a farm environment plan by 2021. I think that was a next generation plan. I think that was a way too ambitious target. But I think the intent's really good, and I think every farmer in New Zealand needs to have a plan where biodiversity isn't something that sits over there and they've got their finance and their fertiliser plans over here, but it actually needs to be right in the middle of their farm plan. So to me, a farm environment plan is actually a whole farm management plan in which biodiversity is central to it. So I think it's really important.
Yeah. Anyone else? And I think this is probably a really good question to even sum it up and for us to close on. There's been lots of talk about shifting the system in the last few days. What is the one thing we could do that would have the greatest impact on system shift towards restoration? And it'd be good if all of you could have a
So I'll
response.
start by saying purchasing decisions. So all these guys run businesses. It's actually consumers that drive behaviour for business owners. And so purchasing decisions is the one thing that can drive change.
I think what I said very early on about we've got to develop a culture of respect and support and trust between all the different players. I think that's fundamentally important.
Yeah. Peter, what's one thing we could do?
So I'll focus on the bit that I think we're least confident about.
Yeah.
And I think the bit that we're least confident about is the economic shift that I think Vicky Robertson talked about yesterday, and you've talked about quite a lot kind of around the last hour or so. What does the transition path look like? So what's actually kind of the A to B, and what are the steps in between? So that's the bit. There's some economic incentives, how it all stitches together with that sort of bottom-up stuff, top-down stuff, the role of regulation. That big picture I still don't have in my head. So if someone could explain that bit to me, that would be great.
We'll try.
I think for me it's communication, actually, at all levels.
Yeah. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi mō tō kōrero.